So we're going to be diving in to the book of Luke, or what is known as Luke Acts. And you might see, well, you probably will see some offshoots, mini series within a series, if you will. And that's going to be Saul's paganism. I also refer back to a few series that I haven't dropped yet, like Mayhem and Meat Bile, but we'll get there eventually. Okay, you are more than welcome to start off by pausing and reading our 12 rules of reading biblical text. And if you don't like the 12 rules, well, this isn't the place for you. If you don't understand the 12 rules, go listen to the audiobook that is uploaded on this channel, because I don't have time to go over it every time. It's our Bible study series that go pretty in depth. Warning, we're not language watching people. We're very salt of the earth, down to earth. It also does not follow the politically correct patterns of modern preachers and teachers. So if you're looking for that, also definitely not the place for you. I also do a lot of referring back to a book that I wrote and read aloud on this channel, that sort of takes you through the entire arc. So if I refer back, chances are I'm referring back to things in that book that you haven't listened to. So if you're confused, try that. And we also did a video where we went, it's short, but we kind of went through our cast of characters here and how all of these modern figures play into the biblical narrative. And we did this so that things could sort of, stick in people's heads about who all of these people are and what their roles are. So if you're confused, go see that. All right, we're going to go to this fucker. Nero, we're picking up in part B of Luke, introduction to Luke. And after this, guys, we're not going to do a terrible amount of history, but sit through the history with me, because I really think it's important to have the proper context and audience and understanding of why we're reading what we're reading and what that lens is. Okay. But Nero, he was the evil emperor, and he's quite possibly and arguably the evilest emperor, notoriously evil through all of history. And you can just, put in Google the 10 worst things, Nero did, and you're going to get a whole fucking list. So he had Seneca, who's a really famous ancient philosopher. This was an advisor of Nero, and he got pissed off at him and ordered him to commit his own suicide. He had a really, really deep love of theater and all things theatrical, like music and plays, which explains the whole Euripides quote and why that was left into the document. Because if Paul's running around saying that Jesus saw him on the road to Damascus and quoted the Bacchae play by Euripides with Dionysus, right? Dionysus was a man god who came down and dwelled into a person, and then they died, and then it's a whole thing about how Dionysus has this sun god resurrection thing. And so for Jesus to come to Paul on the road to Damascus and compare himself to the Dionysus story, we talked about this in Saul on Trial, right? That's a pagan thing, guys. And Rome's going to go, oh, not only is Nero going to understand that story of Paul, but he's also going to relate to it because he gets it. Okay. It's a legal document. He suffocated. He tried to suffocate his mother, but he was trying to make some contraption that would come down out of the ceiling to magically suffocate her while she was sleeping. And that didn't work. So then he tried to drown her, and that didn't work because he jankified the boat. So when she got on the boat, she went out and the boat crashes, but she made it safely to shore, swimming to shore. So that didn't work. And so finally he just said, fuck this, just stab her. And he hired someone to stab her off and kill her that way. He kills his wife in order to have a new wife. And then the new wife was pregnant, and they got into an argument, and he kicked her to death, and both her and the baby died from being kicked to death. There was a big ass fire, and everyone goes around this whole thing with Nero and the fire and who's to blame. And he tried to blame the Christians, and I don't really think he blamed the Christians, as much as they say they do. I think that's more tradition than actual history. But there was a big ass fire. It decimated Rome. And supposedly, by tradition, he blamed all the Christians and killed them. Not necessarily. However, he did still not like the Christians. And he wrapped them in animal skins and they were torn limb from limb by, predators. Or he covered them in flammable tar and burnt them alive during his evening dinner parties. So there are just some of the deeds, rumors, legends, and happy things that Nero has done being emperor. So this guy, he was no joke. And this is who is putting Christianity on trial, and who Luke and James had to defend themselves against, and who Saul of Tarsus was facing for defiling the Jewish temple. And that's where we leave in Acts is Paul is sitting in his prison cell waiting for trial, right? He's sitting there waiting for the end of this trial, and we never see how that turned out. So Acts is one side of the story, because Acts is just Paul's legal brief. That this is the submission of Luke. And I don't even think, although it makes Paul, I don't want to say it makes Paul look good. I want to say it saves Paul's ass by showing him to be pagan, because Nero's also pagan, right? So in a funny way, it aligns it, because Paul knew Nero. He was up there with the aristocrats. So, this is like Hunter Biden's on trial. It's not like Hunter Biden doesn't know, in with the cronies at the top. So Paul knew all these guys, right? So, but I don't, this is speculation at this point. I don't think that Luke wrote Acts necessarily as like Paul's representative. I think he interviewed Paul and got the information from Paul and wrote it in a legal document. I don't think Luke lied about what Paul had done and said, because when you're submitting a legal brief officially to the court of fucking Nero for Paul, I don't really think that Luke is going to lie on behalf of Paul. Like, he's not putting his own ass to be burned alive by Nero, okay, to protect Paul. So I don't think that Luke made it up either. That's why Acts is so important historically, because it's recounting, you can just imagine Luke, who's not a Christian, not an apostle, not a disciple, he's a third party, right? Saying, hey, Paul, tell me what happened. And he's recounting it. And then if he goes, hey, Paul, tell me that story again, and Paul tells it a different way, Luke's not changing it for him and editing it. He's letting it stand the way he told it, because it's going to court. So Luke's not going to edit things and clean it up and make it look pretty. He's just going to be like, this is what he said, dude. This is what he said. Because I don't think Luke's going to put his ass on the line to make Paul look good, right? But ironically, by writing down all of Paul's pagan shit, it made Paul look good, at least to Nero. Does that make sense? Because Nero is pagan too. All right, which isn't surprising, which is why he went to James and got the papers from the vault, from the Matthew, and based his writing about what Christianity is based on James, the books that the Church of James was using. So he went and he investigated the church and said, okay, guys, James, can I work with you? Because the church is fucked. So show me what Christianity is. And we write Luke. And then we go over here and we're like, okay, Paul, tell me your side of the story. And he writes that down. And then he submits the whole thing to Nero. And what it ended up being was there two different gospels. And one of them fits under the umbrella of Judaism, so the church is safe. And then Paul is pagan, and that's safe. That part of Christianity is okay, because it's just another pagan religion. But Paul is still fucked, because now he's a pagan that went in and fucked with the Jewish temple. And that's what happened to his trial. So Paul saved pagan Christianity. Paul saved regular Christianity. So thanks, Paul. But he fucked himself. because the pagan went into the temple and defiled it. So there you go, which was the abomination of desolation, which is huge and on trial with Nero. Okay, so we know who Nero is. We understand the legal things. Here's the temple. Remember I told you James got thrown down the temple stairs? Like, look at how fucking big that wall is, right? Like, this is huge, guys. That's huge. You've got these stairs leading all the way up to these stories through these walls, right? And you got to go all the way up these temple stairs. So that's a picture. And this is the big college courtyard that I told you where everyone would kind of meet. And then you go into the temple through the first gate, right? And there's certain rules for who can go in the first gate. And then there's the second gate. And then there's the Holy of Holies. And they believed in Christianity, or excuse me, in Judaism, of which Christianity was a sect of. They believed that God lived in the temple. And people don't understand how important that is. But they believed that God lived in the temple, which is why your lineage of Levite priests in Leviticus, right? You're only the tribe of Levi were your priests. And they were able to go into the temple and do all of this stuff because they had special priest laws. Why did they have special priest laws? Because they were the only ones allowed to go through that third doorway. Well, over in Ephesians, Paul's teaching all this janky shit about how there is nothing. God lives in you now, and we're all clean, and don't worry. There's no difference. There's no law. All the law has been thrown out. So you're just the same as everybody else. Fuck the Levitical law. Fuck the Moses law. Fuck all the law. God's in you now, and you're clean. So his little Ephesian buddy goes walking right through the fucking first door. Nobody stops him. Goes walking through the second door. Nobody stops him. Hauls his ass all the way into the Holy of Holies as a Greek, Gentile, pagan dude. And all of the Jerusalem flips their shit because he has just completely defiled the temple of God. Now, the Romans don't understand this because to the Romans, gods don't live in the temple. Gods live over on Mount Hermon. Gods live over on Mount Olympus. Gods live wherever, and we make idols for the gods to come down and inhabit these idols during our ritual sacrifices, and then they all run back to Mount Olympus, right? That's why we have all these carved idols running around, because the gods come into these idols, or they come into the people, or they go into the meat, and you eat the meat, and then but to Jews, God lived in the temple. You tell that to a Roman pagan, that's absurd. They're like, we don't get it. Like, what does it matter? That's why Paul's friend goes walking into the temple, because they're like, what do you mean God lives here? Paul just told me God lives in me. I'm the temple. What does it matter? And the Jews flip their shit. And the whole fucking thing is mayhem. And now Nero's got to figure out, okay, is this some new religion that I need to outlaw? Because clearly these Christians are causing a fucking ruckus down in Jerusalem again. So who are these fucking Christians, and why are they always causing a ruckus all over the place? Because Rome just wanted shit calm. So Rome's flipping out and trying to investigate what is this Christianity. Because if it's Jewish, why are they flipping out about the Jewish temple, screaming at the Christians? And if it's pagan, what are they doing in a Jewish temple? We don't understand. So that's the question that was posed before Nero. And Theophilus, of course, Nero's not investigating himself. He's the fucking emperor. So he does Theophilus, his magistrate, right? His judge magistrate guy, who's reviewing the legal case. So Luke and Acts, Christianity, all of it, James's, Ebions, Nazarenes, Essenes, all Christianity was at risk for being declared illegal under the Roman Empire, persecuted, slaughtered, and killed off right then. Thanks, Saul of Tarsus, dumbass. We see that in Acts 20, 21, 21. James the Zedek is like, Paul, you got to go out there and take this Nazarite vow, or they're going to kill you. Okay? Well, while Paul's out there taking the Nazirite vow, his traveling buddy from Ephesus goes in and defiles the temple. And all the Jews are like, dude, dude, the guy who just defiled the temple is one of Paul's students from Ephesus that's been traveling with him and came down here to Jerusalem with him. And now Christian, so it's his fault. Paul's the janky ass teacher running around, and this is one of his disciples who did all this. So Christians now who want to excuse Paul will say things like, well, it wasn't Paul's fault that guy wandered into the temple. Well, it was Paul's student that he was responsible for teaching that God is in you now and it doesn't matter and forget the law. That's Paul's fault. Paul was traveling with him. That's Paul's fault. Paul brought him down to the holiday where there's 50 billion people in Jerusalem. That's Paul's fault. Like, at some point, the teacher has to take responsibility for his disciples, right? So that's why Paul's getting blamed for all of this, even though the guy who walked in wasn't actually Paul. It was one of his dudes that he had taught and he had discipled and that traveled with him and that Paul brought down to Jerusalem. So, Paul, you want to be the big man on campus? Take fucking responsibility for your people. But Christians don't want that. They don't want that, which is why they completely avoid all talk of the defiling of the temple and the trial of Nero, which is such a huge fucking deal. And this was exactly in Acts 20:21, which we saw at the end of Mayhem when James brought him down and bitch slapped him and said, don't you remember the letter I sent you about the circumcision thing? And the Moses, the way you're teaching, and the Jews say you're doing this and you say you're not, and what's going on? Go take a vow and prove to everybody that you're not fucking crazy. Paul goes to take the vow, and his little frenzies go walking into the third doors of the Holy of Holies, into where God lives and dwells and defiles the whole fucking thing with their pagan Greekness, because we understand the cleanliness and the demon covenants and the tableship fellowship. Well, if we've got all those rules and laws, and we've got an entire Levitical priesthood that's following certain laws just to be able to go into the temple, right? Those didn't magically go away, okay? Regardless of what Paul thinks, there's a whole hundreds of thousands of people in Jerusalem that do not believe Paul. So he can't just go strolling into the fucking temple. So there's that. That whole thing's happening. And I can just imagine James being like, fuck, should have fucking killed him when he tried to beat me over the head with a piece of wood. Shit. As soon as Barnabas brought him to me the first time, I should have killed that. No, I doubt James would think that, because James was so just. They described him as, his knees were like camels from kneeling so long and praying for the people. So not what James would have thought, because James was just that righteous. But I digress. He was still a badass. So the Jews went bananas, and you can see this janky ass teaching of Paul that led to this. You can see it throughout Ephesians 2 and in Acts 17. Trophimus is the guy who defiled the temple in Acts 21, that whole thing. And you've got your Hebrew perspective of what the temple was versus your Rome perspective of what temple was, and where that whole thing breaks down. So basically, the church, Paul has to defend himself. Luke is defending Paul from civil insurrection charges and making Christianity illegal. Because if you defile the temple, right, you're a pagan and you go fucking with the Jews, that's like a civil insurrection. You are like inciting a riot. And the last thing the Roman emperor wants in all of its far off lands is riots happening, particularly with these janky ass fucking Jews who are always causing a problem down in Jerusalem. And now we've got these fucking Christians always causing a ruckus wherever they go. So Rome just wants everyone to shut the fuck up. And there was such a riot surrounding this action that Saul was sitting on charges of civil insurrection. And then all of Christianity was about to be made illegal. So Luke's got to, put in both sides of the story. The church's story comes out in Luke, and then Paul's story comes out in Acts, which is why it's Luke Acts and not just Luke and Acts. And the many pagan references, we talked about that, makes it attractive to the pagan, the Roman pagan guy. So in a way, he was also defending Paul. So Paul's paganism actually saved his ass a little bit. Now, James's church, the Ebionites, when this all was published, there is a ruling in the history books where James is dead by now, I'm pretty sure. But his church that carried on, the Ebionites, gave a ruling about these two publications because they didn't just write them and pass them around to the people. So, these were, court documents. So when the court documents were the trial's over and everything's done and it's years and years later, the Ebion's like, well, what do we do with these writings? And so the Church of James, long after all of this, gave a ruling in the early 100s that says the original Luke, prior to Constantine's tampering, of course, the original Luke that he wrote for this purpose was okay to be read by Christians. But the book of Acts should not be read by Christians because it doesn't have Christian theology in it. It has Paul's side of the story for a court document where he's explaining his pagan version of Christianity to a pagan court. So Christians shouldn't read that because that's Paul's pagan side of the Christianity. That's not our side. So this ruling is actually in the history books where James's church said, go ahead and read Acts. That's our position on Christianity. But no, go ahead and read Luke. That's our church, the official James, working with Luke to get this written from the original Hebrew Matthew. Go ahead and read that one. That's the church position. The Acts, book of Acts, we don't recommend that one because that's Paul's janky pagan version of Christianity that he submitted to the emperor. Now, does this mean that everything that Luke recorded in Acts, Paul truly believed? We don't know. Did Paul add the story of, when the light in the desert talked to him, the light in the desert quoted the play by Euripides? Did the light in the desert really quote Euripides? Or did Paul just say the light in the desert quoted Euripides to kind of sum up to Nero a little bit because Nero really liked the theater? We don't know. So I'm saying that's why Paul's story is so fucking janky and all over the place, because we don't know where Paul's telling Luke this is what really happened and he's telling the truth, or this is what I want you to write what happened. I'm going to lie to Luke in order to suck up to the Nero guy. Does that make sense? So like if you're going to Nero's court, you're like, oh, and the light in the desert told me, wait a minute. The judge, the emperor, really likes pagan plays. Oh, he told me that thing about and then Paul made it up on the spot, telling Luke, that part. So we don't know. We don't know what the light in the desert even said now, because did it really quote? Clearly it wasn't Jesus quoting a pagan play about a sun god. That didn't happen. But does Paul even claim that it happened? Or is Paul just throwing it in there to suck up to Nero? We don't know, which is why Acts is so dangerous to read and extremely dangerous to read out of context of this court case. Either way, at the end of the day, we know that Luke was the church's position about what Christianity was, and Acts is Paul's account of what he was doing, of what Christianity is. So that's what we have. So the Church of James said it was okay to read Luke. That was okay. But the book of Acts should not, because it was written for a purpose that wasn't meant for Christians. It was written for a pagan court. However, what's really cool about this is because James helped Luke gave him access to the books, and Luke was investigating. I don't want to say James helped them, but I want to say, James cooperated fully by letting Luke see the books that were locked in the vault, right? What ended up happening is Luke ended up being like a preaching to Theophilus while submitting to the court documents from Acts through the book of Luke. So, Luke is sort of like the evangelical. What's great is it ended up that, Theophilus gets ministered to by the true word from the word of James, the Church of James, while he's collecting this stuff for court. And I think that's just funny, because isn't that just how God works? So that's why we're reading Luke. And I think it's a great story. And now you have the historical context of the story. And we love you. And we'll be back next time to actually read the book of Luke. Bye.